Ukraine deployed a $200 balloon toward Moscow last September. Russian air defenses lit up in response, and 3 years of combined arms doctrine quietly became obsolete. That is what happened, not a simulation, not a concept paper from a defense think tank. A balloon, filled with gas the way you'd fill one for a birthday party, drifted on the west to east wind across the front line, and forced Russia's most expensive surface-to-air missile systems to make a decision they were never designed to make. And the decision they made, over and over, will keep echoing through this war in ways that are only becoming clear right now, in the last week of June 2026. Let me be precise about what we're actually talking about, because there's a tendency to treat this as a quirky sidebar when it is anything but. Ukraine has been using these balloons in the past primarily for surveillance or as decoys, cheap, wind-borne platforms that bait Russian defenses into firing million-dollar S-300 and S-400 interceptors at targets costing about $200, draining the batteries that guard Russian cities. That was the first use case, the crude version, the one that worked well enough to keep doing. But what happened between then and now is the story, and the story has accelerated faster than anyone in Moscow was prepared for. This is Professor David, and if this kind of analysis is what you're here for, hit subscribe. Takes 2 seconds. You won't miss what comes next. Ukraine is now developing a missile that launches from a balloon at the edge of the stratosphere, built to fly through Russian jamming. It's called DART. It drops from a balloon at about 7 to 11 miles altitude, runs on satellite guidance until it falls to about 4 miles, and then its navigation cuts out entirely. A solid fuel engine carries it along a fixed course. Once the navigation shuts off, Russian jammers cannot pull the missile off target. Think about that sequence for a moment. The jammer arrives too late. The navigation system's window closes before the terminal phase. It's not that DART defeated Russia's electronic warfare. It's that DART was designed so that Russia's electronic warfare is simply irrelevant for the most dangerous part of the flight. Engineers from the Center of Innovative Technologies program have developed this air launch system. The missile is lifted into the sky on special balloons, and launches take place at high altitude, in the range of 12 to 18 kilometers. The DART rocket is 1.84 meters in length. Its empty weight is 13 kilograms. The warhead can range from 3.5 to 10 kilograms, depending on configuration, consisting of graphite-based penetrating elements. A 13-kilogram missile that Russia cannot reliably stop. Launched from a balloon that costs a fraction of a percent of what Russia spends to intercept it. Now zoom out, because the balloon itself is only one thread in a much larger fabric that's being woven right now across the Eastern Front. Ukraine tested a Hornet strike drone launched from an aerostat at approximately 8 kilometers altitude, with the balloon carrying the drone 42 kilometers before release. Ukrainian operators claim the tactic could extend the Hornet's range from approximately 150 kilometers to around 300 kilometers by combining the aerostat's range, altitude energy, and preserved battery charge. That last part matters more than the headline number. Reports indicate the Hornet used only about 5% of its battery during the ascent phase attached to the aerostat. The balloon drop effectively doubled the range of the drone. The logic is almost elegant in its simplicity. You don't burn fuel climbing. You don't burn fuel cruising the first 40 kilometers. You arrive at the drop point with nearly full battery, at altitude, positioned to glide before your motor even needs to engage. The aerostat itself carries the drone horizontally toward the target area without any battery drain, effectively adding the balloon's range to the drone's own. The altitude of release provides the drone with a significant potential energy advantage. A drone released at high altitude can glide a considerable distance before its motor even needs to engage, conserving battery power that would otherwise go to the climb phase of powered flight. 3 mechanisms stacked on top of each other, each one free. That's the insight. The balloon provides range for free. The altitude provides a gravity-assisted glide for free. And the preserved battery provides a full power envelope for the actual strike. You are essentially getting a 300-kilometer weapon out of a 150-kilometer weapon at negligible additional cost. Russia has known about this problem for a while. They've been watching it develop, and they have had very few good answers. Since autumn 2025, Ukraine has launched over 1,000 balloons into Russian territory. It only takes 15 minutes for an experienced team to launch a balloon like this. 1,000 balloons, 15 minutes per launch. You cannot build a radar network responsive enough to catch everything. You cannot build an interceptor fleet deep enough to shoot it all down, not when the cost exchange is this lopsided. And you especially cannot do either of those things when you are simultaneously losing the very systems that were supposed to be doing the intercepting. Here's where the arithmetic becomes genuinely sobering for Moscow. As of March 2026, the number of S-300 and S-400 components, the backbone of Russia's air defenses, were reduced in every military district. In the Eastern District, down 70%. In the Central District, down 81%. In the Southern District, down 60%. Even around Moscow, down 28.5%. The Leningrad District, down 76%. Pause on those numbers, because these are not preliminary estimates from a Ukrainian source trying to spin a narrative. These are drawn from confirmed, open-source analysis of video evidence and satellite imagery. The Eastern Military District, down 70%. The Central Military District, down 81%. Russia's air defense architecture is not being nibbled at. It is being dismantled, systematically, district by district, system by system, radar by radar. In late March 2026, a Ukrainian strike put out of action the Russian S-400 Triumph in the Tula region, a mobile launcher capable of engaging nearly 100 targets simultaneously. Days earlier, the Bryansk region's Buk M3 system suffered the same fate. In January, a 9 S-3-2M1 radar, part of the S-300V system, was destroyed with video evidence to support it. And that was just the first quarter. Ukraine carried out 44 successful strikes against various Russian air defense systems during the first months of 2026, according to data compiled by OSINT analyst Clément Moulin. Then today, June 29, 2026, Ukrainian Defense Forces drones struck a Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense position near Kerch and a major 220 and 35 kilovolt substation in Crimea's Kermansky district early on June 29th, triggering fires at both sites and causing widespread power outages across occupied territories. This morning. This isn't historical context. This is what is happening right now, as of the timestamp on this script. The campaign did not slow down. It did not plateau. It is running at an elevated pace into the second half of 2026. And here's the thread that connects the balloons to the dead S-400s. The Votkinsk plant, the absolute backbone of Russia's ballistic missile production, responsible for the RS-24 Yars, the Bulava submarine-launched missile, and the Oreshnik hypersonic ballistic missile, was struck by Ukrainian FP-5 Flamingo missiles, traveling more than 1,300 kilometers unchallenged, taking advantage of fully cleared flight corridors. The Kremny EL plant, Russia's second-largest supplier of chips for Iskander missiles and even S-400 systems themselves, was devastated by Storm Shadow cruise missiles, penetrating through holes in the radar network. This is the cascade. You destroy the radar. The corridor opens. You send a cruise missile through the corridor. The missile hits the factory that makes the guidance chips for the next generation of interceptors. Now Russia cannot replace the systems at the pace they are being lost. The gap widens. More corridors open. More factories are reachable. The feedback loop is not theoretical. It is running right now, and it has been running since at least early 2026. Russia's flagship systems, the S-300, S-400, and the newer S-500, were designed to kill fast, high-flying targets, jets, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. A propeller drone crawling along at 150 to 200 kilometers per hour, 50 meters above the treetops, sits in an awkward seam between those systems and short-range guns. In one June 2026 raid, Russian forces claimed to shoot down around 180 drones over Moscow, yet the targeted refinery still burned. That sentence is worth reading twice. 180 intercepts claimed, the refinery still burned. Because what Russia's air defense was designed to intercept is not what Ukraine is sending. Russia's air defenses are, as analysts told CNN in June 2026, simply not fit for purpose against this kind of attack, not equipped to detect, track, and engage swarms of small, slow drones. Western sanctions have also hampered Moscow's ability to source the electronics needed to build new systems tuned to the drone threat. The cost math runs entirely against Moscow. A long-range Ukrainian strike drone in the FP-1 family reportedly costs around $55,000. A modern Russian interceptor, a Tor or Pantsir missile, never mind an S-400 round, can cost many times that. When a defender spends $1 million missile to down a cheap drone, the defender loses even when it wins. Multiply that across a single night. Ukraine launched over 1,000 long-range drones at Russia in August 2024. That figure grew to more than 3,000 in July 2025 and reached approximately 7,000 in March 2026. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed to have intercepted a record 8,973 Ukrainian long-range drones in May 2026. If even 20% of that May figure successfully struck their targets, that's somewhere around 1,800 individual strike events landing on Russian territory in a single month. From drones, without a single manned aircraft. No pilot at risk, no multi-million-dollar jet in the game, just factories, garages, and assembly lines in Ukraine, building what Russia cannot afford to shoot down fast enough. Ukraine's defense ministry reported that mid-strike drone production jumped roughly 312% in the first 4 months of 2026, compared with all of 2025. Western officials, cited by CBS News, said Kyiv can build deep-strike drones faster than Russia can manufacture air defense missiles, depleting Russian stocks at what one assessment called a possibly unsustainable rate. Unsustainable. That word is doing a lot of work. What it means practically is that at some point, not immediately, not in a week, but at some definable point on the current trajectory, Russia runs out of the missiles it needs to protect the factories that make the missiles it needs to protect the factories. The self-referential nature of that crisis is not an accident. It is the strategy. In 2025, estimates from Ukraine's intelligence services suggested Russia had more than 400 interceptors on hand for S-300PM and S-400 air defense systems. That stockpile has been burning through faster than it can be replaced. Ukraine has depleted Russia's stockpiles, forcing it to expend anti-aircraft missiles to intercept new and more advanced drones that fly faster and farther than previous models. Russia lacks key components for the production of interceptor missiles, with the country facing difficulties obtaining such components from Western and Chinese manufacturers. And Russia knows it. Ukraine's deputy defense minister pointed out that Russia could not produce enough air defense systems to protect its vast territory, and posted photographs of Russian improvised air defenses, including truck-mounted R-77-1 air-to-air missiles. Truck-mounted air-to-air missiles. This is what improvised looks like at the edge of a system that was supposed to be the most sophisticated layered defense architecture on the planet. Step back for a moment and look at what Ukraine has actually built here, because it is genuinely different from conventional warfare doctrine in ways that the U.S. military is paying close attention to. Helium-filled aerostats anchored along the front lines of eastern Ukraine have become an indispensable component of the country's defense infrastructure. They enable reconnaissance and kamikaze drones to reach more distant targets and help Ukrainian forces find enemy drone control ground stations tens of miles away. Projects are already underway to use these floating watchtowers as hubs for interceptor drones, ready to take down the enemy's unmanned aerial vehicles as they approach. The same technology doing 3 different things simultaneously: surveillance platform, strike range extender, counter-drone hub. Aerobavovna-made balloons can monitor territory within roughly 10 kilometers and transmit real-time imagery and intelligence. Operating at altitudes of up to about 1 kilometer, they can also help extend communications coverage, in some cases reaching up to 100 kilometers. The aerostats can carry electronic warfare payloads, including systems capable of intercepting and analyzing communications and radar emissions. One asset, multiple functions, deployed in minutes, operational for days. The CEO of Aerobavovna put it plainly: drones require frequent charging and skilled operators. Aerostats can offer persistent long-term solutions with lower operational costs. When you are a smaller economy fighting a larger one, persistence at low cost is not a preference, it is a survival condition. And Ukraine has been meeting that condition in ways the defense establishment is still absorbing. The debut of balloon-launched weapons comes at a turning point. Ukraine has clawed back more ground than it has lost for the first time since its 2023 counteroffensive, a shift the Institute for the Study of War has linked to Ukraine's emerging drone dominance over Russian technology across land, sea, and air. That edge has begun to reshape Kyiv's leverage at the negotiating table, drawing American interest in its battlefield technology as Zelensky presses a mid- to long-range strike campaign that sends cruise missiles and one-way drones as far as over 600 miles into Russia, what he has branded the country's long-range sanctions on Moscow's war economy. Long-range sanctions. That framing is deliberate. Reuters reported in spring 2026 that nearly all major refineries in central Russia had been forced to halt or reduce production following Ukrainian drone strikes, with the combined capacity of affected facilities exceeding 83 million metric tons per year, roughly a quarter of Russia's total oil refining capacity knocked offline or degraded in a single campaign cycle. Russian diesel production fell from 7.5 million metric tons per month to 5.9 million metric tons in April and May 2026, a decline of more than 20%. Russia subsequently began planning to import gasoline by sea. Russia, a country ranked among the world's largest oil producers, sitting on some of the world's largest reserves, planning to import gasoline. Because Ukrainian drones got through the air defense that was supposed to prevent exactly that outcome. On June 20th, 2026, Zelensky announced that Ukraine has developed upgraded long-range drones capable of striking targets at distances of up to 3,000 kilometers. Now our drones can reach targets at a distance of 3,000 kilometers. Grateful to the engineers of Firepoint, he said. 3,000 kilometers. That is not a range limitation anymore. That is essentially the entire Russian Federation within reach of Ukrainian systems, regardless of where they are positioned inside the country. The geography of Russian strategic depth, which for centuries provided a nearly automatic defensive advantage, has been compressed, in practical military terms, to almost nothing. You cannot retreat beyond the reach of a drone that has 3,000 kilometers of range and a full battery charge, because it was dropped from altitude by a balloon that carried it the first leg of the journey. Now, it is worth being precise about what remains unproven, because intellectual honesty about the limits of what we know is part of how you actually understand what's happening, rather than just absorbing narrative. The Dart missile is currently moving toward official codification by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. It has not yet entered full operational service. The Hornet range doubling via aerostat is an operational estimate from Ukrainian sources and should be treated as such until confirmed. The cascading destruction of Russian air defense has been documented at scale, but Russia retains significant capacity around its most defended installations, and adaptation is ongoing. What is beyond dispute is the economic logic driving all of it. Ukrainian drones, costing a fraction of the interceptors Russia fires to shoot them down, are defeating a layered air defense system that includes the S-300, S-400, Pantsir S-1, Tor, and Buk complexes, systems whose combined procurement value runs into hundreds of billions of dollars, and whose operating costs per intercept far exceed the cost of the drones they destroy. And the production math. Ukraine plans to produce more than 7 million drones in 2026, according to Deputy Defense Minister Serhiy Boyev. Unmanned technologies have become the backbone of asymmetric defense, he said. 7 million. The United States, the largest defense economy in the world, produces around 100,000 combat drones per year. Ukraine is building 70 times that number, from a wartime economy under sanctions pressure. Ukraine's strategic trajectory toward reliance on homegrown defense technology is accelerating markedly. Resource scarcity, funding constraints, and industrial limits force careful allocation and relentless creative iteration. Embedded engineers collaborate directly with private sector developers, constantly refining low-cost fiber optic and radio frequency command and control solutions for kinetic drone missions, with particular emphasis on deep strikes and frontline operations. Fiber optic and AI-guided systems fielded in Ukraine are bypassing the radio frequency jamming that current NATO counter-UAS investment is built around. That is the line that should be setting off alarms in every Western defense ministry that has spent the last decade building jamming-centric counter-drone systems. Ukraine's binding constraint now appears institutional rather than technical. Fragmented counter-UAS legal authority and EW-centric procurement are being outpaced by jam-resistant autonomous systems, and closing that gap will require a coalition-level response. This is where the story becomes relevant beyond the war itself. because the lessons being proven in real time over eastern Ukraine are the same lessons that will govern the next armed conflict involving any major power. The U.S. Army has been evaluating a tethered balloon known as an aerostat to detect drones and relay communications, with an eye toward launching drone swarms from it. The American military is watching and adapting, but it's adapting to a playbook that Ukraine is writing under live fire, under existential pressure, with no margin for error. Russia's compounding EW dilemma. Jammers that previously protected air defense assets are now being hunted by jam-resistant drones, meaning the protective layer is being removed sequentially. Russia's likely countermeasures include physical dispersion of jamming assets, increased mobility cycling, and layered point defense around high-value EW platforms, though each imposes its own operational cost. Each countermeasure costs. Each adaptation strains an already strained military-industrial base. The war has shown that Russia's air defense is a complex system whose effectiveness directly depends on industry, logistics, and the constant replenishment of resources. It rests on a production base that is heavily dependent on imported and scarce components. Russia is forced to use missiles more quickly than it can produce them. Russia's air defense formally remains effective here and now, but its long-term resilience directly depends on Russian industrial capacity to sustain production, repairs, and modernization under conditions of sanctions and battlefield losses. Here and now. That phrase is doing a lot of work, because here and now is one timeline. The trajectory is another. And every week the balloons fly, every week the Dart missile gets closer to operational codification. Every week the Hornet extends its effective range another 30 kilometers via an aerostat nobody thought to budget for. The gap between here and now and what comes next closes a little further. The Institute for the Study of War wrote, "Russia does not appear to have fully developed or deployed mobile fire teams, drone interceptors, or other low-cost distributable systems to defend against repeated massed Ukrainian drone strikes." This is 4.5 years into the conflict. Russia has not solved the problem of cheap drones, and Ukraine keeps making the drones cheaper and more numerous and more capable, and now is launching them from balloons that cost $200. There's a pro-war Russian military blogger, Rybar, one of the most widely followed Kremlin-adjacent voices with 1 million subscribers, who captured the internal Russian frustration after drones burned through Moscow's refinery in June, despite the capital being ringed with more air defense batteries than anywhere else in the country. He wrote that everything that flew over Moscow was shit and sticks that had been known about for 2 years, and that these shit and sticks burned through the best air defense missiles in the world, costing millions, depleting the air defenses, and the result is video of a burning refinery. For 3 years, everyone in the know has been talking about the need to build small air defense out of the same junk, the kind you can make in a garage. A Kremlin-aligned commentator writing that Russia needs to defend itself with garage-built systems because the billion-dollar systems aren't cutting it. That is not a talking point from Kiev. That is a frustrated insider observation from within the Russian information ecosystem. The balloon changes the geometry of this war in a way that is still being absorbed. It is not just a weapon. It is a force multiplier for every other weapon. It extends drone range without consuming drone battery. It delivers missiles above the altitude where jamming is effective. It carries surveillance payloads that expose radar positions, which then get targeted by follow-on strikes, which then open corridors through which cruise missiles travel to factories that make interceptors that could have stopped the drones if those factories still had their roofs. The cascade is not metaphorical. It is a documented operational sequence playing out across the Russian military district map. Zelensky announced a 40-day influence operation aimed at compelling Russia to end the war. The mechanism for compelling Russia, in his view, is not manpower, it is not territory, it is economics and infrastructure struck through corridors opened by the systematic removal of the air defense that was supposed to prevent exactly that. And the balloon is one of the instruments creating those corridors, at a cost that barely registers on a defense budget. This is the part that military historians will study for a long time. Not the sophistication of the system, the cheapness of it. Ukraine's balloons can reach distances of up to 4,000 kilometers and carry different payloads, reconnaissance equipment or signal amplifiers to help long-range drones find their way. A balloon made of latex or mylar filled with helium, carrying a payload that multiplies the lethality of the system that rides along with it. 4,000 kilometers of potential range from a device that inflates in 15 minutes. The west to east wind is an accident of geography, but it is an accident that consistently favors Ukraine. The prevailing winds across the front blow west to east, so a Russian balloon launched at Ukraine tends to drift back over Russia instead, a quirk of geography that runs in Kyiv's favor. Russia cannot use their own balloon program offensively in the same way. The atmosphere itself is running against them. None of this means the war is over. None of it means Russia is about to collapse. What it means is that the military calculus has shifted in a direction that is increasingly difficult to reverse. Every S-400 battery destroyed to the west of the Urals is a corridor. Every corridor is a refinery reachable, a factory reachable, a supply depot reachable. Every destroyed factory is a slower rebuild of the systems that were supposed to prevent this exact sequence. At some point in this chain, you stop calling it attrition and start calling it structural. Russia's Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said last year that it is impossible to protect all of Russia's critical infrastructure from drone strikes. Impossible. The official Kremlin position is that total protection is not achievable, which means the only question remaining is how much gets through, and how fast, and what it costs Russia each time something does. By punching corridors through Russia's layered defenses, Ukraine has enabled deeper incursions. Nights in Moscow now see up to 300 drones swarming, disrupting airspace over the Russian capital. Over Moscow. Over the capital of the country that has spent decades positioning itself as the world's premier developer of integrated air defense. The city surrounded by more air defense batteries than anywhere on Earth. And 300 drones per night are making it through anyway, or close enough to it that the infrastructure still burns. What began as a cheap surveillance tool evolved into a decoy, evolved into a launch platform, evolved into a communications relay, is now evolving into something the defense establishment doesn't have a clean name for yet. It is part sensor, part infrastructure, part weapon, part force multiplier. It is deployed in 15 minutes. It operates for days. It costs roughly what you'd spend on a decent second-hand car. The question that will define the next phase of this war and the next decade of military planning in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing is not whether the balloon works. That much has been answered. The question is whether the industrial democracies watching this unfold are adapting fast enough, and whether the lesson they take from Kyiv is truly internalized or merely noted and filed away until the next conflict forces the same reckoning at a much higher price. Because the balloon didn't make Moscow's air defenses useless on its own. The balloon is the instrument. The erosion is the result of thousands of individual decisions, innovations, and improvisations by engineers working in garages and workshops across Ukraine, building the future of warfare out of mylar and helium and fiber optic cable, one launch at a time. This is Professor David. I'll see you in the next one.